It is obvious that we can no more explain a passion to a person who has never experienced it than we can explain light to the blind. Success is not about how much money we have in the bank, but it's about how many people's lives we have impacted through it. Success is experienced when we do things which are never done before. Being that I went to jail and came back, I went through a whole new experience in life. I went from being at the top to back down at the bottom again. In jail, you get stripped of your freedom and everything, so I experienced different things, learned more. A lot of people who have experienced trauma at the hands of people they've trusted take responsibility, and that is what's toxic. What each must seek in his life never was on land or sea. It is something out of his own unique potentiality for experience, something that never has been and never could have been experienced by anyone else. Censorship is never over for those who have experienced it. It is a brand on the imagination that affects the individual who has suffered it, forever. I grew up in a bookless house. My parents didn't read poetry, so if I hadn't had the chance to experience it at school I'd never have experienced it. But I loved English, and I was very lucky in that I had inspirational English teachers, Miss Scriven and Mr. Walker, and they liked us to learn poems by heart, which I found I loved doing. I have experienced failure as a politician, and for that very reason, I am ready to give everything for Japan. I have experienced heartbreak, but not in a classical sense. You don't need the world to understand you. It's fine. Some people will never really understand things they haven't experienced. Some will. Be grateful. Censorship is never over for those who have experienced it. It is a brand on the imagination that affects the individual who has suffered it, forever. Unless you have experienced it, it's difficult to describe the virulence of the Twitter storms that were unleashed on Trump skeptics. Nevertheless, whether in occurrences lasting days, hours, or mere minutes at a time, I have experienced happiness often, and have had brief encounters with it in my later years, even in old age. My election only proves that the citizens are tired of the experienced politicians who over the past 28 years created a country of opportunities to steal, bribe and loot. I have passed English medical examinations in Hong Kong. In my youth, I experienced overseas studies. The languages of the West, its literature, its political science, its customs, its mathematics, its geography, its physics and chemistry, all these I have had the chance to study. During the Great Depression, African Americans were faced with problems that were not unlike those experienced by the most disadvantaged groups in society. The Great Depression had a leveling effect, and all groups really experienced hard times, poor whites, poor blacks. My father was from Northern Ireland, and coming from somewhere like that, your faith defines you. That's something we don't really understand outside Northern Ireland, but because of my parents and grandparents, I've experienced it. Talk to successful entrepreneurs. Learn about what they've experienced so you can avoid some of the pitfalls that come with wealth. Surround yourself with smart, dedicated people. To build something isn't a one-man show. It's more important to have smart people who really believe in what you're doing than really experienced people who may not share your dream. The tax on capital gains directly affects investment decisions, the mobility and flow of risk capital, the ease or difficulty experienced by new ventures in obtaining capital, and thereby the strength and potential for growth in the economy. The best part is still ahead of me. I haven't experienced my good old days yet. For having lived long, I have experienced many instances of being obliged, by better information or fuller consideration, to change opinions, even on important subjects, which I once thought right but found to be otherwise. Problems can be experienced as a chance for renewal rather than stress. What one has not experienced, one will never understand in print. Leadership is all about emotional intelligence. Management is taught, while leadership is experienced. I'm not an old, experienced hand at politics. But I am now seasoned enough to have learned that the hardest thing about any political campaign is how to win without proving that you are unworthy of winning. We think about education as a stepping stone into a higher socio-economic class, into a better job, and it does do those things, but I don't think that's what it really is. I experienced it as getting access to different ideas and perspectives and using them to construct my own mind. I have been to the occupied Palestinian territory, and I have witnessed the racially segregated roads and housing that reminded me so much of the conditions we experienced in South Africa under the racist system of apartheid. Everything changes with time. I am not so experienced enough to analyze what the people love in me. Anyone who hasn't experienced the ecstasy of betrayal knows nothing about ecstasy at all. All I can say is I am sensitive to discrimination on any basis because I have experienced that upset. It's often difficult for those who are lucky enough to have never experienced what true depression is to imagine a life of complete hopelessness, emptiness and fear. We are all captives of the picture in our head, our belief that the world we have experienced is the world that really exists. Happy the man who, like Ulysses, has made a fine voyage, or has won the golden fleece, and then returns, experienced and knowledgeable, to spend the rest of his life among his family. Men who have a pierced ear are better prepared for marriage, they've experienced pain and bought jewelry. There's different kinds of love, and I'd never experienced that kind of totally platonic love. All the love I've experienced has always been a kind of deal, and now, as I get older, I realize that there's this other love out there. Our uniqueness makes us special, makes perception valuable, but it can also make us lonely. This loneliness is different from being alone. You can be lonely even surrounded by people. The feeling I'm talking about stems from the sense that we can never fully share the truth of who we are. I experienced this acutely at an early age. And you know, when you've experienced grace and you feel like you've been forgiven, you're a lot more forgiving of other people. You're a lot more gracious to others. If I can create some space that people haven't experienced before, and if it stays with them or gives them a dream for the future, that's the kind of structure I seek to create. The amount of death terror experienced is closely related to the amount of life unlived. It put our energies to sleep and made visionaries of us, dreamers and indolent. It is good to begin life poor, it is good to begin life rich, these are wholesome, but to begin it prospectively rich. The man who has not experienced it cannot imagine the curse of it. Proverbs are always platitudes until you have personally experienced the truth of them. Nothing ever becomes real till it is experienced. I am a big fan of long drop, composting toilets. I like the cycle of using waste. When you have experienced one and seen what comes out of the bottom, it is amazing stuff. It's the most beautiful, driest, sweet-smelling compost. Despite all I have seen and experienced, I still get the same simple thrill out of glimpsing a tiny patch of snow in a high mountain gully and feel the same urge to climb towards it. The experienced fighting pilot does not take unnecessary risks. His business is to shoot down enemy planes, not to get shot down. I've experienced great things, I've experienced great tragedies. I've done almost everything I could possibly ever imagine doing, but I just know that there's more. War is sweet to those who have not experienced it. I was probably about 22 years old when I recommitted myself to get off the fence and go all in and get serious about my faith. That's really when I experienced God's love and His forgiveness and His true grace. Someone who has experienced trauma also has gifts to offer all of us, in their depth, their knowledge of our universal vulnerability, and their experience of the power of compassion. Visit our website for more quotes, quoting.com.